There's been something about this show that I've been circling around in my mind for months, and I haven't really been able to articulate. We talk a lot about tech on the show, but I don't really consider it an ag tech podcast. We talk about sustainability, but I certainly wouldn't describe it as just a sustainable agriculture podcast. The surprising realization I've had here 8 years into doing this is, in many ways, this show is about ag economics.
It is shockingly accurate what we can determine with simple economic models.
That's Dr. Trey Malone, an ag economist at Purdue University. Listen to how he describes ag economics and see if you see the same connection I do to what we're trying to do here on the show.
That's our real comparative advantage is marinating on big questions like that and trying to come up with actionable insights.
Today's episode goes so many interesting directions that I think you'll really enjoy, from the bullwhip effect to the choice overload problem, how farmers' social networks impact their tillage decisions, what keeps employees engaged in ag jobs, and so much more.
The thing that I honestly am the most concerned about is this significant decline in real dollars that are going to publicly available agricultural research in America.
Ag economist Dr. Trey Malone on today's Future of Agriculture podcast. Hello, fellow ag nerd. Thanks so much for joining me for another episode of the Future of Agriculture. My name is Tim Hammerich, and if you are interested in where innovative ideas meet practical realities in food production, you have found the right show. This episode has been a long time in the making. I've known Trey, at least from a distance, for years now. He almost came onto the show earlier this year, but was offered his dream job to move from Arkansas to Purdue. So we put it on hold for a few months until he could get settled in Indiana, and now here we are. In addition to being an ag nerd, as all of you know, I have always had an interest in economics, specifically in what drives markets and what drives behavior. I did start my career as a commodity trader, which obviously is very much on the front lines, I would say, of the ag economy. I read Freakonomics many years ago, and I'm a listener to a lot of podcasts like Planet Money because it's so fascinating to me. So why it took me so long to realize that what I'm trying to do here with the Future of Agriculture is bring together my science and tech nerdiness with my business nerdiness. And when I say that the show really is at the core about ag economics, I'm sure a lot of you out there listening are probably saying, duh. But to be honest, I never consciously thought of it that way. And I share all this with you because I'm hoping that this episode, depending on your feedback here, is just the start of featuring many other economists. No, I'm not going to stop covering ag tech or sustainability or science or any of the other topics we regularly cover here on the show, but I do want to make a concerted effort to highlight the interesting work that our country's over 2,000 ag economists and plus the ag economists around the world are doing. And this episode with Trey, I think, is just a great place to start. For his bio, Dr. Trey Malone is an agri-food economist and the Boehlje Chair in Managerial Economics for Agribusiness in the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. His work focuses generally on strategic marketing and strategic decision-making, especially as it relates to what universities can do for industry. He's published over 60 research articles in outlets including Food Policy, Journal of Business Venturing Insights, and the American Journal of Agricultural Economics. Before Purdue, he worked as an ag economist with the University of Arkansas, and before that at Michigan State University. His insights have been featured in popular press outlets including New York Times, Time Magazine, CNBC, CNN, USA Today, Fast Company, and Popular Science. And now the Future of Agriculture podcast. One quick technical note before we dive in, because I still somehow managed to make rookie mistakes after 8 years of doing this. My mic wasn't working during this interview, so my audio was picked up without me knowing it via my earbuds. And apparently those were rubbing against my collar the whole time. Annoying, I know, but the audio is still clear. Just try to ignore the background noise on my end. But I'm going to drop into the conversation here where Trey is explaining the role of the ag economist in the overall agricultural industry. Enjoy.
Well, it starts with a conversation, right? It starts with an ongoing conversation, really, where you develop these relationships between what the academic literature calls the triple helix. So you have the industry side of innovation and decision making. Then you have the government side, which we're all familiar with. And then the third part of the triple helix, which is where I live, is on the academic side. So, in an ideal world, the way that you push some innovative decision or some entrepreneurial venture forward is through that combination of the three. So my job quite often is to talk to stakeholders, to give lectures or whatever, and either over coffee or beers at the end of the deal, we have a discussion of what the university thinks or what the academics think about X problem. And so that allows me to be a little bit more honest and open, I think, because I do have tenure, right? Like I can talk about things that I think that there are other folks who might not be able to discuss the same topic. And also, it allows me to spend a lot more time reading research. For example, I've published about, I think it's 64 journal articles now on everything from the standard corn, soybeans, dairy, but into tart cherries and hops and morel mushrooms, if we want to get super weird. But like that flexibility in my role lets me speak to a bunch of different areas where I just don't think you can in another avenue.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, you're I don't know if you're from Michigan. I think you're from Kansas, but you spent a lot of time in Michigan, which is extremely diverse in terms of agriculture. Then down to Arkansas, also diverse in very different ways in terms of crops and agricultural systems. So you've had a lot of kind of a broad exposure there. Maybe talk about kind of what led to your current role.
It was a long journey. So I did grow up in Kansas. The family ranch is in Oklahoma. Where I'm from, it's kind of wheat, corn, soybeans, beef, cows, and then repeat. So as an undergraduate, I wanted to see what it was like living in a city. So I lived in Kansas City, Missouri. I went to a Jesuit Catholic school. It was interesting living somewhere where I'm from. If you hear sirens, you go outside to see what's going on. Where I lived in Kansas City, if you hear sirens, you go inside. So I had a really good experience there. And kind of stumbled into agricultural economics, honestly. I growing up, I didn't really know what that meant. I knew that I enjoyed economics, but the discovery for me that there was this whole field that existed that focused on these big questions, it was super exciting. So I did my Ph.D. at Oklahoma State. There was a guy named Jason Lusk who's there, which if you're not familiar with Jason, he's arguably the most famous ag economist, right? And just one of the best people. He's the vice president of agriculture at Oklahoma State now. And so there we studied behavioral economics. We started looking at kind of how cognitive biases influence, especially consumer decision making, and what those biases might mean for people down the supply chain. So that kind of launched me into this position in agricultural marketing as an assistant professor at Michigan State, which is the second most diverse ag state in the country. And so I was there, particularly during the COVID times. I learned a whole lot about the flexibility and the resiliency of some supply chains over others. There was a wild time that I was probably on the phone with a reporter 4 or 5 times a day, just explaining different disruptions or how the disruptions that we're seeing, from policy or from COVID sicknesses and numbers was translating into different agri-food supply chains. From there, I switched down to Arkansas, which is very much like, the backyard of the world's largest grocery store. So listening to how the CPG firms and the big buyers consider the agri-food system was a completely different look. And so now I've been at Purdue for about 2 months now, still getting my feet settled, but really loving the trajectory that took me into this role. I say this is my dream job, and I really do mean it.
That's great. Several things that you mentioned there are different tangents I want to go down. But the first one is, okay, so let's go back to COVID for a second. And you're fielding all these calls from journalists that want to know, like, what's happening with, insert product here, cherries,
right.
Everything, asparagus. Exactly. Yeah. As an ag economist, what is your process for making sure that you can answer that with clarity and with accuracy? Are there certain reports you're reading? Is there certain data you're accessing? Is it a lot of calls with people in industry? What is your approach to making sure you're on top of all that stuff so you can field those questions and guide your research?
It's all of the above, right? Like trying to do your best to pay attention to everything that's going on. The other thing that I think is super important, and as academics, we tend to do this poorly, is to know when you can't speak to something. In Michigan, I could look around at all of the I states, right? I could look over at Minnesota. I could find somebody to talk about corn, soybeans. I could find somebody to talk about pork or cow-calf markets or whatever. But when it comes to some of the specialty crops, well, that's a little bit more heavy of a lift to find someone who could knowledgeably discuss blueberries or tart cherries. How many tart cherry economists do you know? Probably not many. And so that was really in COVID times, I was trying to focus more on the weird stuff that people weren't thinking about, because then I could, field those, we'll call them unique questions, where I don't want to call them less unique, but the traditional questions could be answered by some of the other economists in the world. We have a huge network. I think I've mentioned this to you in the past. I was just at our annual meeting of American agricultural economists, and there were about 1,300 of us in New Orleans together. So there are a lot of us out there, and all of us have our own unique specialty.
Do you have to just kind of Google like everyone else, or are you tapping into that network as sort of a starting point, for tart cherries as an example? And I'm asking purely selfishly. I find myself in a position that I need to do a lot of research either for this podcast or for clients I work with. You use blueberries as an example. I produce a podcast for the blueberry industry. And so I found myself having to start from scratch as far as like understanding what the heck's going on in the blueberry industry. So I guess I'm looking for, selfishly, your tips on how I can stay on top of things.
So for a long time, I was very heavily involved in Twitter. I think Twitter has gotten a little bit exhausting, for lack of a better word. So
we agree there for sure. Yep, for sure.
So I switched over to newsletters. So every morning starts with AgriPulse. The beauty of this topic specifically is what we're actually typically more interested in are what are called marginal changes. So I don't need to understand the perfect supply chain for blueberries. I need to understand how some new trade policy was going to impact what already exists. One that I like to discuss is apples. So you had this explosion in interest in Cosmic Crisp apples a few years ago, and it's still there. But for a while there, it just kind of hit the market and took everybody by storm. When that happened, a lot of it was me just kind of working backward to figure out why that change happened, what might be the implications using some of the economic tools that we have, and what data might we be able to use to explore the trend overall.
Okay. This is going to be a bunch of selfish questions in this episode, so I hope people love this, but there's a lot here I personally am interested in. When you said Cosmic Crisp, it reminded me of when that first variety first came out. I received, I will call it an aggressive PR pitch to get someone on my podcast to talk about Cosmic Crisp. They must have invested high six figures, perhaps seven figures into the PR campaign for Cosmic Crisp. And I wonder how much of that led to what you're talking about, which is like this explosion in interest. The connection between marketing and demand, is that something that you look at in your capacity a lot? One of the reasons I'm personally interested in this is I work with ag marketing associations. And so like, I'm always curious about like, how well are they doing at linking their efforts to actually demand generation?
Well, I mean, that is the fundamental question I think that we have to ask ourselves in agriculture is how are we shifting appropriately or inappropriately from the traditional push supply chain where you had this everybody just wanted apples. So long as I could grow Red Delicious, it was okay, right? To a world now where I don't know how many different varieties I can buy of apples in any grocery store, Walmart, you name it. Even I could probably go to a Quick Trip and pick up 6 different kinds of apples. So there is this change that's happened, particularly around how consumers engage in the food system. So my dissertation actually was on craft beer, which I like to say that I started my field work when I was about 18. But in that craft beer study, what we were really interested in is, partly beer, but partly what this explosion in the number of beer options could tell us about agricultural marketing more broadly. So the average grocery store in 1975 had about 8,000 unique SKUs. The average grocery store now has more than 45,000 unique SKUs. The correlation here between beer is that there were less than 100 breweries in the United States in 1980. Now there are something like 10,000 breweries, each of which making 12, 15 different beers. The underbelly, though, is that there is still severe consolidation in the beer industry. But the U.S. consumer typically doesn't recognize that consolidation and mostly just sees an explosion in the number of brands. And so I think I say that to put it in the context of agricultural marketing having a much more difficult job now than when a lot of these generic advertising campaigns might have started in the 80s, because we are just competing at this much deeper level, psychologically even.
So what do we make of all that? Because I think I put it up there with, some tropes that we'll often hear, like consumers want to know where their food comes from, or consumers want choice, or, the picture you just painted with the craft beer, like used to be like Budweiser, Coors, or Miller. Which guy are you? Right now, it's like all these other options. I guess in the context of the podcast, Future of Agriculture, what conclusions can we draw from all that?
Okay, so my job market paper, when I just finished my PhD, the first thing that I ever published out of that dissertation was on choice overload. So this option that there are all of these options out there. In the choice overload literature, generally speaking, economists believe that more choices are better because it increases the chance that you find something that actually fits you. Now, anybody that's ever picked a movie on Netflix can tell you that usually isn't how it works, right? You spend more time looking for the Netflix movie than actually watching it. And so what I wanted to do was find a market where I could, in fact, identify this choice overload problem. And the next question, the follow-up question is, once I have found that market that has choice overload, is there a way for me as a marketer to turn it on or turn it off? So I picked a wine bar in Oklahoma and convinced them to double their number of beer options to see what would happen to the likelihood people would order beer at this wine bar in Oklahoma. Because what better place to have choice overload for beer than a bunch of wine drinkers in my family's home state? So we did it. We doubled the beers and we decreased the chances somebody would choose that beer. So we actually decreased sales by increasing the number of options. So choice overload, yep, it existed there. But here's the nuance. As soon as I added some type of nudge, we'll call it, I could eliminate the choice overload problem. So if I highlighted a special, just literally just bolded the letters, I could turn it off. My favorite was I could put on beer advocate scores. So I could just emphasize the score, the ranking from 1 to 100 of a beer, and I could eliminate the choice overload problem. So this goes back to why you were bombarded by Cosmic Crisp requests. In essence, they're looking to you to be the third-party verification to the thing that they just developed. To me, it just really emphasizes the importance of trust for the intermediaries between the industry and between the consumer. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. It has my mind racing of like, okay, well, what are all these nudges? Where can I find a list of nudges? Because that's I could see that taking many different forms.
If you ever want to waste a lot of time on Wikipedia, just look up cognitive biases. I don't know how many hundreds of cognitive biases are listed on Wikipedia, all of which are linked to some type of psychology research.
So I've read Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, and I found that to be really, really fascinating. I mean, so when you say in your PhD program you worked on cognitive biases, but you just told us kind of what that looked like, connect those dots for us.
Yeah, so typically the belief system for at least some of the behavioral economics literature is, we'll call it paternalistic in nature, where we say we're going to identify a consumer bias, and because we think that creates a bad outcome, we are going to use some government policy to reduce that outcome. So they call that libertarian paternalism. So the idea that I'm not forcing you, but I am leaning into you a little bit on your insurance program or whatever it is. What I was interested in is this intersection of how marketers or how marketing also does the same exact thing. And specifically in this ag space, because I really cannot overemphasize, like we're working on a textbook right now on agribusiness management. The original draft of the textbook was written in the 1980s. And I cannot overemphasize how different that agribusiness management structure needed to look in 1980 versus in 2024. And it's because of this explosion in information, I don't know, consumer interest even in what they eat, in globalization, right? So yes, I could tell you a lot about the U.S. consumer, but the reality is that a lot of industries now are looking toward international markets. So, Japanese biases for beef are going to look different than U.S. biases for the same cut. And so these are the things that you have to, as a manager or somebody involved in a decision-making process in agriculture, you need to be engaging in that strategically.
This is really fascinating. Are there any other, kind of major differences in this, while we're on the textbook project, other major differences that you see of how agribusiness management has changed in 40 years now?
So I spent all morning refreshing the chapters on supply chain management. I'm almost certain that there was no chapter on supply chain management in 1985. I think that the concepts were there to some extent, but the importance that we place on logistics, procurement, et cetera, is at a level that I don't think that they would have seen in the 80s. There's been a rapid change in technology. So when I'm working on this textbook, I'm thinking, all right, never before has an edition talked about AI, the artificial intelligence kind. So where does that fit in what is this increasingly globalized food system? So one thing that my co-authors and I have been discussing is there was a chapter on international agriculture and agribusiness management internationally. But I've been kind of pushing back saying, you know what? All agribusiness is international now. So maybe we should almost be not emphasizing that so much in a chapter, but emphasizing regional economics a little bit more, because the international is almost the beginning point at this stage. And there's a reason why the Biden administration has plowed hundreds of millions of dollars into revitalizing regional food systems. It's because those aren't the norm anymore. For better or for worse, that's a value-free judgment. But these create a lot more complicated logistics that can butt up against geopolitical conflict, that can butt up against technology gaps, that can create issues within public policy in the EU that you now have to be aware of if you're trying to market into the EU. The list goes on and on about the differences, I think, that a modern agribusiness manager has to focus on versus a 1985 manager. Not to take away from the 85 manager, it's just a different thing now.
Well, and a lot of what you're describing with agribusiness management and with marketing is obviously very relevant to those within the value chain. What about for people more upstream? For a farmer that might ask, like, how much of this do I really need to care about? Like, how much of this really needs to enter my own kind of farm business management mindset when it comes to marketing? Because I come from a commodity trading background where farm marketing meant like basis, like managing risk with basis and futures. But now my interest is much more on the marketing in the more pure sense of like kind of that push-pull concept you were talking about earlier. How do you answer that question about how much a farmer needs to be tuned in to the current trends in agricultural markets?
Well, okay, I'll answer it in two ways. The first part is that even though not everybody buys your corn directly from you, everybody does vote. And so, for example, one of the papers that I published early in my career was on Prop 2 in California. And, when the majority of California consumers end up voting against something that they buy on a regular basis, like there is something that matters here. I think in that regard, we in ag often believe that we just need to tell our story louder. And I think that the challenge there is that when we tell our story, there's a song in our head that we can't not hear, that if the consumer has never heard that song before, they have no idea where you're coming from. So like it's important to have a two-way conversation with those people. And that's, I think, partly why this matters. The other reason why I think this discussion about biases, et cetera, matter in the marketplace is because of this concept called the bullwhip effect. So the bullwhip effect is this really popular idea in supply chain management, where small unanticipated changes at the consumer level can create larger and larger issues down the supply chain. So when we think about COVID, right, you had this unanticipated shift in consumer demand that nobody was expecting. We've planned out our biological lagged process to hit the number of chicken wings that we needed for March Madness, and then March Madness doesn't happen, and now we have a ton of chicken wings. And so we saw that in the data for chicken wings, where chicken wing prices went super low, and then they popped back up because there wasn't the same type of demand, and it created these huge ripple effects for poultry. We could talk about it with eggs, right? So you had consumers who stopped going to restaurants, and so the breaking stock egg prices went down below the cost of bottled water. But the shell egg prices at the grocery store went through the roof. And everybody remembers the shell egg prices, but had they just bought the liquid eggs, they would have been able to save a lot of money. And so these shifts are in large part induced by the biases. And the last thing that I guess I should say is farmers are subject to just the same number of biases, right? So we've got a paper where we were looking at conservation tillage from about 10 years ago. There was this long-term project where they were looking at increasing conservation tillage practices in Michigan soybeans. And the researchers were a little bit frustrated because they would make recommendations and the farmers wouldn't listen to them. And so I asked the simple question of, well, who are these farmers and how well do they know each other? Are you getting individual observations? Are they making individual choices, or is this kind of a groupthink piece? And so we actually asked the farmers in the experimental sets to talk about how well they knew each other. And with that social network matrix, we could predict tillage intensity. And we found that the more socially connected you were, the more social pressure you were feeling, the less likely you were to adopt the new tillage practice. Right. So there are all types of biases that exist at the consumer level, and we can talk about those. But those biases also exist down the supply chain as well.
This brings up a question in my mind of basically, do people really change, period? And from an economist perspective, a lot of times what you're looking at is people's choices. How do you wrestle with that question of like, do people really change, or are we just going to have an AI model that can pretty much predict how everyone's going to react to everything in the future?
I mean, there are fundamental principles that I think we can typically hold to be true. So I teach in our executive level MS MBA program, which is honestly it's the most unique graduate program I've ever seen. You get an MBA from the Kelley School of Business at Indiana University and an MS from us in Ag Econ. And so the way that I kicked off the class this semester was talking about markets. So we created what was called a double oral auction market, which is very deep, like the guy who won the Nobel Prize in economics at Purdue University, he invented it. And in that market interaction, if I can set my supply and demand curves the way that I expect them to exist, I can predict the equilibrium price and quantity with about 80, 95% accuracy. It depends on the group, but it is shockingly accurate what we can determine with simple economic models. And so are people messy in their decision making? Yeah, but in an iterative process, usually we can make these predictions on the fly. I say that to maybe support this idea that like people aren't going to change and maybe they shouldn't. But what can change, I think, is the rules of the game or the trends that are surrounding them. Here's an example that I think is super interesting. So I was working with a horticulture professor at Michigan State, and she was talking about how the floriculture industry, the greenhouses in urban areas, always assumed that everybody wants to pick out their own flowers. And so they didn't think they needed to worry about online ordering very much because at the end of the day, yes, you want a tulip, but you're going to pick out that tulip yourself. Well, as it has turned out, there is a massive market for online flower sales. And that market is very expensive because the shipping costs are super high at the equilibrium price. But it was I think, something that industry is going to have to deal with. And are they going to change? Well, they sure better, because the consumer has changed in the way that they buy things.
That stuff really interests me, and kind of the different business models that come from changes like that. Is that something that you economists explore as kind of like, obviously you are researching the changes that are happening. And a lot of times when I see economists give presentations, it's usually kind of pretty macro trend oriented, but who's really kind of digging into what business models come as a result from some of these changes? Is that something that you look at as well?
So that's something that I want to write in the next book. Is really just unpacking these novel business models that have been developed over the last 40 years. One that no one outside of agriculture understands is cooperatives, right? So how do cooperative models engage with the modern world? There are kind of the old generation cooperatives and these new era cooperatives. What do those look like? People talk about agriculture, and this, that people like to say it like it's one thing. And the reality is that like it is hundreds, if not thousands of things that are just somehow woven together to get the clothes on your back and the food on your plate. And so, who is working on what? Well, it depends on the industry that we're discussing. For your listeners, I think the best place to start is whatever state you're in, go pay attention to what their agricultural economics department is doing in state. So when I lived in Michigan, we didn't have any rice economists on the payroll, right? But then I got down to Arkansas and we had like 4 rice economists. So I still don't really feel like I know that much about rice. I learned more than I ever thought I would. But every single place is going to have its own nuances and its own unique needs. And so I think about a lot of this stuff, I suppose, at the macro level, just like we all do. But if you want to get into the weeds, I promise you can find an agricultural economist for you.
I had an interesting conversation with a farmer listener after one episode where we were talking about the levers that might change farmer behavior. And his opinion was for sure that, like, you talk about a farmer like they don't have the ability to make their own choices. Like, we're not just individual people out here, that we're just the products of levers, be it policy or markets. My perception is actually, humans in general, not just farmers, are the result of the incentives that are in front of us. Do you get that pushback, and how do you think about that?
One thing that I would immediately push back on is I think that in agriculture, or people's perceptions of agriculture more broadly, they have this belief that it's just the farmer who makes choices, right? So I want to study agriculture, so I'm talking about farmers. Well, I don't think that that's fair. I think that farmers are a part of this very big system, and they're an integral part. They're very, 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 very important. But you have ag retailers that are making recommendations on what they're going to do for input choice. You have feed yards who are going to make choices on what the market is going to look like when they decide to go to slaughter. I mean, you have all of these different components of the agri-food supply chain, if we want to call it that all have their own incentive structures as to why they make the choices they do. And the reason I bring that up is I think especially around the sustainability and environmentalism aspect, and maybe even animal welfare, there is this belief that like farmers are the problem or something. And I really just don't find that to be true. I think that the farmers are responding to the markets, to the policies, and to the, honestly, oftentimes the limited knowledge that they have of the options that they might be able to choose. So I mentioned feed yards. We've got a paper in review right now where we were looking at what are the motivations for the employees who work at feed yards to stay around. Turnover is a huge issue for some of these agribusinesses. So what are the things that we might actually be able to do to create a more positive work environment and improve the lives of everybody in that supply chain? These are tools, I guess, if we want to talk about levers that might be able to change the behavior or the outcomes of the individual. But I think, at least knowing what levers exist can be very helpful to anyone.
I mean, it's an interesting conversation because I hadn't considered that perspective. I just had always assumed that I am the result of the various incentives that exist around me, and that it kind of, applies to everybody. I'm curious on the feed yard. I know it's in review, but did you find anything interesting about what keeps people at feed yards? Because I think that applies to a lot of us in agriculture looking to hold on to employees.
Well, I mean, the obvious answer is that it depends on not just the type of feed yard, I suppose matters, but your job at the feed yard is what matters even more, right? So there are different categories of human resource management that have to be dealt with depending on the area. Ultimately, most of the human resource stuff typically says you need to make sure that people feel valued and that there is some version of upward mobility. In ag, we particularly struggle on the upward mobility component sometimes because, we talk about this all the time, that the average age of the farmer in the United States has increased dramatically. I think that there is this question mark for people. I'm 36, for people my age. When I think about my friends in agriculture at about my age, and they think, well, I'm not going to be able to make the on-farm decisions for another 40 years anyways. So why am I going to stick around? And so that upward mobility and that sense of feeling valued, I think, has a huge component there.
You emphasize in the United States there to imply that elsewhere we're not seeing the average age of the farmer quite so high. Is that right?
Well, in Brazil, it's declining. So, that's one of those like fun facts that it kind of blew me out of my chair the other day, that we talk about the U.S. ag system being this like rapidly aging population, and people are worried about intergenerational farm transfers and all these things, and they should be. But I think we assume that the United States looks just like everywhere else. And it just is not the case. And so, here at Purdue, actually, we work quite a bit with understanding Brazilian markets and Brazilian producers because, frankly, they just treat the world differently than we do. And I think there's a lot of value in understanding those international perspectives.
Do you know what has caused the average age to decline in Brazil?
So this is the beauty of research, right? Like that's a good research question. I think part of it is that you can keep adding land into production, right? So you have this at least opportunity for younger farmers to get involved without having to, carve out some parcel from a hugely consolidated farm that's been around for 100 years. It's just a different incentive structure. I think part of it also is the opportunities that we have in the United States versus in Brazil, right? So my family lives kind of on the border of Alva, Oklahoma, and Greensburg, Kansas, out in the armpit of the panhandle of Oklahoma. And if you don't want to stay there, I've got two sisters that moved to California, and they do not do anything even remotely near agriculture. And so, they're making, frankly, I think more money than I am, but they don't have to work with farming, and they're fine. So those opportunities exist in a way that I don't think they exist in Brazil. But honestly, that's me editorializing. So this is a perfect example of where I think there is a need for industry to partner with people like me to unpack these differences between what we might be able to armchair versus what is true in the actual data. And we can spend some time digesting it, where a producer is going to have to make choices on the fly. And that's our real comparative advantage is marinating on big questions like that and trying to come up with actionable insights.
Well, what are some of the big questions you see ahead for agriculture? In the context of this podcast, Future of Agriculture, what are the big questions that you and your colleagues will be facing in the coming years? Or is that something where we kind of just respond to whatever the questions of the day might be?
Yeah, well, we should be flexible on our questions, but I can name a few that I'm kind of obsessing over right now. Consolidation in agriculture is going to be a continuous conversation. I think that's not going to slow down. So understanding what that means is going to have a lot of value. I think understanding where technology fits in ag. McKinsey put out a pretty big report a few years ago where they listed agriculture as the least digitized industry in America. So I think there is some really interesting area for opportunity there. The big questions of what do we do with a declining labor force, size of a declining labor force? Where do robotics fit in that? That's something I think about. What are the business models for these robotics companies that actually might make sense on farm? The thing that I honestly am the most concerned about, if I think about like where I fit or where we fit, is this significant decline in real dollars that are going to publicly available agricultural research in America. China has dramatically increased its public research funding for agriculture. At the same time, go to any College of Agriculture in America, go into their College of Ag building, and tell me that's not the most disgusting bathroom you've ever seen. These things are old, they're falling apart, and it's true across the board. And so I think that for me, that creates this question that overlaps with the consolidation issue. So at what point are we more or less locked into certain industries, certain companies deciding what technology is and isn't worthwhile? How do we commercialize technology from universities where we're kind of just drowning in our own lack of funding?
Man, there's so much we could dive into here. We have to have you back on because I know I'm getting close to the hour I asked of you. Maybe before we close, one thing I'd love to get from you is, because you're so well read on these topics, is, if somebody was interested in ag economics, are there any particular books that aren't too academic of a read that might, give us some good insight into how ag economists approach the world?
So this one's a little bit old and a little, maybe it's 10 years old, maybe less. But Jason Lusk, my advisor, wrote a book a few years ago called Unnaturally Delicious. And the impetus for the book was the number of food is broken books exist. That COVID proves the food system's broken. The world is melting. The Malthusian prophecy that population growth is going to outpace food production and we're all going to die. And so actually he and I came up with a book idea while we were driving down to an academic conference of ag economists to basically push back on that and say, what are the things that science and technology are doing that are preventing us from that Malthusian prophecy? So the book's a really easy read, very accessible. I've led a few book clubs on it even, just because they're very simple, bite-sized chapters on, okay, let's talk about pink slime, for example, or let's talk about the biotech that's being developed to address certain climate issues. Like all of these type of things are very much in the book and super easy to read. That's probably the quick one that you can buy for like $2 on Amazon. And I would say it's very much worthwhile.
Trey, thank you so much for this. Anything else we should either add or emphasize before I let you go here?
The last thing that I'll say is I'm really easy to get a hold of. And most of us are, at least who have some type of extension background or who have this kind of passion for the land grant mission. So if you want to reach out and shoot me a message on LinkedIn or something, I'm more than happy to tell you that I'm not the person to answer your question, but I might have an idea of who does. I also really like drinking beers and solving all the world's problems. So if anybody wants to do that, just let me know when you're in West Lafayette.
I, for one, will take you up on that next time I'm there. That would be awesome. But I also want to get some more recommendations for you for other ag economists. I think you've actually given me a few already to have on the show. I want this to be a regular occurring thing because I haven't even come close to tapping into the interesting research and insights and ideas that are coming out of you and your colleagues. So looking forward to that. But thank you for today. Thank you for being on the show. I think this is a good starting point for more of these types of conversations.
Hey, I really appreciate being on. I think I told you before, I've been paying attention to this podcast for like a decade now, however long you've been doing it.
8 years now, yeah.
So, it's really exciting for me to even be a part of it. So thank you for that. And I look forward to more conversations.
Well, I look forward to it as well. Thank you so much to Dr. Trey Malone of Purdue University for being on the show. Lots of follow-ups here. I definitely want to do more episodes with agricultural economists. So many interesting tidbits in there. That episode went a lot of different directions, which usually is not what I'm looking for, but in today's case was exactly what I was looking for. If by chance you're a student or maybe a young professional that's considering doing an MBA or master's in ag econ, highly recommend you go check out their program, the joint program between Purdue University and Indiana University. I've met other people who have gone through that and highly recommend you check that out. And we'll also leave a link in the show notes to learn more about the work that Trey is doing. But thank you again to Trey. I'd love your feedback on this type of format of just kind of asking the economist about various things that are going on in agriculture and what the data is actually telling us about where the future of agriculture is headed. As always, thank you so much for listening. I do not take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.